Hello and welcome to Community Tapestry. I'm Napoleon Bell, the Executive Director with the City of Columbus Community Relations Commission. We'd like to welcome you to another great show, and we'd like you to welcome our co-host again, Miss Toni Teague.
Thank you. It's good to be back, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, all of those, you know, but you know what? We still don't have snow.
Yeah.
No snow.
But you know what? When we get it, we're going to get it.
Yeah, I know. That's why I got a big snow blower in the garage. Well, I actually have two snow
man.
blowers in the garage. I'm going to be trying to make a little money, but also keep my driveway clear
That's
of
good.
the snow.
Well, wait a minute. We don't live very close to each other,
No,
so I guess I'm out of the game.
You are out of luck. You're out of luck. But we've also got a lot of great events coming up.
Yeah, January is a busy month.
January is a very busy month, you know, with the celebration of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
And Black History Month directly
Coming
after
right
that. But, you know, civil rights is a big issue. Some
And
people,
it's a year-long thing.
It's a year-long thing. But sometimes people think that it's passé.
Right.
That we don't need it anymore, you know, what's up with this affirmative action, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's also one of those issues that people tend to think, oh, civil rights is just one of those issues for African Americans or minorities. But we're realizing, and we're here to tell you today, that civil rights is something that protects all people.
Exactly. And so we've got two great people here to speak on that topic and more. So let's get to that. So next to me, dressed the same here, is Brandy Martin Klein of the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. I'd like to welcome you to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. And then next to her is Frederick Gittes of the Gittes Law Group, civil rights attorney here in in Columbus, Ohio.
Yes.
I'd like to welcome you to the program.
Thanks.
Well, let's first start with Brandy. The OCRC, the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and I'm just going to give a little history here. In 1959, Governor DeSalle created the Fair Employment Practices Commission for Ohio, and then in 1961, the legislature changed the agency's name to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. So from 1961, the OCRC has seen a lot from 1961 today, and how things have progressed. You know, so you're involved in understand the cases that are coming in now. I mean, is it still a factor of a lot of cases coming in complaining of discrimination, and what kind of trends are we seeing?
Absolutely. It's still as important today as it was in 1959 when the agency was created. We still see a steady stream of cases coming in on an annual basis. We see at least 5,000 cases of discrimination that are filed with our agency every year. In times where we have less employees employed, because of the high unemployment rates, that I think speaks volumes and says a lot about the number of discrimination cases that we see and the amount of discrimination still occurring in the state of Ohio. So it is really important, and it is important for people to understand their rights and for employers to be aware that these things still do occur.
Wow, thank you so much for giving us that summary. And the fact that you said 5,000 cases?
Yes.
In the last year.
Yes.
You're right, and there's fewer employees. So, Fred, we've got to get to you, the attorney, in the issue of civil rights. Tell us about your history with as an attorney and some of the key things you want our audience to know about you.
Well, I want people to know more about the problem and the solutions than I do about me in particular. But I've been a lawyer since 1975, and civil rights has always been a big part of my practice. And anybody who says that civil rights aren't important, and unfortunately there's more and more of them these days, even in the current presidential selection race, at least on the Republican side, there's open statements about we should eliminate anti-discrimination laws, at least I think Ryan has taken that position, and some others are advocating it around the country. These are people, I think, who haven't ever had to deal with the experience of discrimination, and they've lived a very protected life if they don't know about the problem. You can't hardly pick up a paper in the last few years without reading about church burnings. I mean, people think, well, that happened back in the 60s. Well, it still happens today, and not infrequently. If you read the papers, in fact, there was just the decision in Franklin County recently where a jury awarded $500,000 to a 67-year-old woman who worked for a hotel chain, who's one of the managers who was involved in making a decision said, get rid of the old lady. And people need to recognize civil rights is definitely about race discrimination, but it's about many other kinds of discriminations. And anybody who's watching this program, I urge them to recognize something. You could have a bad accident and be disabled, and the discrimination laws protect you from your employer firing you, not because you can't do the job, but because they think a disabled person might be a problem, or they have stereotypes about people being ill, needing treatment, or just not being able to work simply because they're disabled. You may be over 40 years old if you're lucky, maybe over 50 or 60 as you go through life, and there are a lot of employers who will get rid of people who are older for any number of reasons, but they have stereotypes. We all make jokes about getting old, but unfortunately, those jokes and stereotypes are applied to people who are very energetic and are still creative. There are some of the greatest compositions by composers in the world were written by some who were 70 years old. And if you let age be a decider, they would have never been able to do that. Right. And I could go on. Basically, all working people, almost all working people, at some stage of their life are protected by discrimination laws. Maybe they practice a religion that's not popular. They're protected from being fired or discriminated against because of that. Maybe if you're a woman, if you haven't heard the word sexual harassment, and for a substantial percentage of women, they've experienced sexual harassment. If you're a veteran, there are anti-discrimination laws that protect you from discrimination for serving your country. I can go on. They're vital.
Let me ask you this, though, because sometimes, you fall into those classes and you maybe not know. You talked about a disability. Would something like asthma, let's say you have an asthma issue, but the employer wants you to walk the property or something. If you're, do you see that as but and you can't do that particular job, but you can work clerical in the office, but you're fired because you have asthma? Would that be something? I mean, I'm trying to take it to the minimum and the maximum. Right? Some people think of disability as I'm missing a leg.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they think of you as visibly handicapped.
Well, it's an individualized situation. It depends on the job. For example, maybe you can't work overtime. So the question then is, do they really have to have every worker work overtime? In many places, many workers want to work overtime, and others who may have a condition, maybe an illness, that means they can work 8 hours a day, but they can't put in a whole lot more than that, but they can work a great 8 hours. So in that situation, the employer can't say that working overtime is essential. If it's not essential, then the person who's disabled should be allowed to continue, and it would be illegal to fire them. In the asthma case, if walking the grounds is an essential part of the job, then unless there is another kind of job which is available and the person's qualified for, they would not be protected. You have to be able to do the job with accommodations. In other words, if they can do something that is not really burdensome, like lifting jobs. Let's take that as an example.
Or even walking the grounds if there's a golf cart, that they could still get around the grounds and do the inspection in the same way that a person walking could. Asking for reasonable accommodations, something that aids the person complete the task in the same manner that it would have been done otherwise.
Wow, so if they would have a golf cart, then they should be able to allow that employee to use that golf cart.
It's about reasonable accommodations. Sure. We've got a call on the line. Caller, will you go ahead with your comment or question?
Yes, I have a question for the attorney. It's about the federal courts. Race discrimination cases for the past few years don't seem to be that popular in federal courts in terms of success. Can you shed some light on why that might be?
Well,
thank you, caller, for your question.
And by the way, I know I'm the lawyer, but I'm also Fred, so if people call, they can just ask for Fred. it's not a question of popularity. Race cases have always been difficult. And unfortunately, until we change the nature of the way people think about each other, they're always going to be difficult. Because in the federal court, you have to have a unanimous jury. One juror can cause a hung jury, so you don't get a verdict. You must win every juror. If you have one juror who's got stereotypes or biases on a jury, who comes in there with an attitude, you can lose the case. Also, especially these days, and in the last 10 years, I think even more so, and plus we have a president who's an African American. It's so easy for people to believe and convince themselves, gee, it just couldn't be race discrimination. And so instead of looking at the evidence and listening to the evidence and letting themselves be open to it, they come in with a closed mind, convinced there's no such thing as race discrimination.
I would add that even today, race discrimination cases in particular, but also all discrimination cases are very difficult to prove. You have to prove that the discrimination actually occurred, and people know today, they're savvy enough to not overtly say, we're not hiring you because of your race, or we're not hiring pregnant women today. They're savvy enough to get around that, and proving that as an employee becomes tremendously difficult. So I would add that even prior to getting to a jury, at our level at the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, it's extremely difficult to prove a case of discrimination.
Well, let's ask that then. Let's break it down to, I feel as though I've been discriminated against. What do I do? And let's talk about this process through the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and then also, if they choose another route to retain you as an attorney.
One of the things that I would say for employees is, one, to know the internal policies at your place of business. And one of the things that we always advocate for, whether we're training with employees or with employers, is to know the internal processes, know where and when to report discrimination. And always starting at the level of employment with your employer is the best place to start. There are timelines in which a person can file with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, which is 6 months, but they always have that option. So we always advocate that the employee file a complaint internally and allow it to be resolved at that stage. If it's not resolved and they feel that they need to take further action, they certainly at any point in time can come to the OCRC and file a charge, and they can avail themselves to our process, which entails, and we try to resolve the issues at every step of the process. We have a mediation program that's highly successful. Every party has the option to participate in the mediation program. We have highly qualified mediators throughout the state of Ohio that will sit down with both of the parties at the table and try to come up with a solution to the problem. If that fails, then we will investigate and we will look at the facts just to determine whether or not discrimination has occurred, and that is our only goal. So beyond that process, and if there is a verdict, if we find a recommendation of discrimination, we find that discrimination occurred in this case, then we will take it on to the next step of the game. There will be a hearing held with our administrative law judge, and it will go to the Attorney General's office. And I think this is the part where Fred would come in and represent people who feel that they have been a victim of discrimination.
And I want to say before we cut into you, Fred, that I'm just thinking from the employee standpoint, that's got to be a lot of anguish that they go through. I mean, to think that, I may be filing a suit against my employer, will I be able to remain employed during that time? There's a lot of anguish that goes on into it.
There's a lot of anxiety that is put on an employee. It's not an easy decision to file this because every employee that comes before us is always fearful of losing their job. They think that if they make any sort of complaint or any sort of waves in their place of employment, that they're going to lose their jobs. But they should be aware that there are laws in place that protect them against retaliation. So that is something that they can know, be aware of, and not be fearful of. It's something they should not be fearful of. So it's something we highly encourage them if they feel that they've been a victim of discrimination. And I think also when we talked earlier about whether or not discrimination still occurs and how difficult it is to prove and changing people's mindsets, when we turn someone away and we say, no, we didn't find discrimination, like I said earlier, it's very difficult to prove. And it's not that we turn them away and think that absolutely it did not happen.
Right. Because it could have happened, you just hard to prove.
We just can't prove it.
Very difficult to prove. There's oftentimes not a smoking gun. But it is an extremely difficult process for an employee to be engaging in.
I can only imagine. Fred, tell us about your experience and some of what you've observed with your clients, potential clients and actual clients.
Well, there are a lot of things I would like to say, and we don't have time for all of them. But first of all, anyone who is experiencing discrimination, and I want to stress again, we're not just talking about race discrimination or sex discrimination, but whether it's your age, your disability, your religion, your national origin, the first thing you need to do is to talk to someone. Of course, I think it's best if you talk to an attorney. I do not advise people who are concerned about discrimination to necessarily go first to an HR department or even an EEO officer at a company. You need to think through what you're doing, why you're believing that there's discrimination, what evidence you have that there's discrimination. It's like anything else. If you don't think about it before you do it, you make mistakes. You know, you're not a good basketball player unless you think about how you're going to do it. You're not a good artist until you at least think a little bit about what you're going to draw and how you're going to give the vision or the image you want. It's not easy because you're dealing with your livelihood, the livelihood of your family, if you have a family, and there is retaliation. Many of the most recent cases, in fact, recent U.S. Supreme Court cases, are about individuals who have been fired after they filed a complaint. And they won their case because they proved retaliation, whereas the jury wasn't so sure about the discrimination itself. It is a serious step. Consult somebody. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come into my office who have made a complaint inside the company, and instead of having gathered information, thought it through, followed certain procedures internally, kept notes, made sure they knew the facts correctly, it was too late. There was nothing I could do for them. But had they consulted with someone earlier, they might have been very, very successful.
Wow. Well, we want to also make sure, we're going to get to the cases here in just a minute, some great cases that you guys have worked on. But also, we want to give the viewing audience an opportunity to give us a call. So make sure you can give us a call at 645-6557 or 645-6557. And we are also on Facebook at Nap Bell. So if you want to ask a question on Nap Bell.
He's on now.
I'm on right now. So you can make that a question on Facebook in case you don't want to call. So we talk about cases. And we talk about, is this really, is this still relevant? Is this thing still happen now? Talk to us, each one of you, about maybe a recent case that, where people would go, you got to be kidding, that's come across your desk.
I can talk about a lot of cases that have come across the desk of the Ohio Civil Rights Commission investigators that really make civil rights relevant, because these are the things that you would imagine would have happened back in 1959 when the agency was created. And one of the most recent examples of that is a case out of the Cincinnati area where we had a housing situation where the tenants were swimming in the pool. It was a couple that lived there, and the husband had a daughter from a previous marriage who was biracial. And after his biracial daughter swam in the pool, the landlord put up a sign on the pool that said, "Public swimming pool, whites only."
Wow.
And that is not something that anyone expects to see
I'm shocked and
in,
appalled.
in 2011, 2012, even in the year 2000. So I think that these are the kinds of cases that we're seeing that we wouldn't expect to see today. But it's the reason why civil rights is still important and why it's still relevant today. We see a number of cases like this. We had a case in the northern region of Ohio where an employer, every time an employee would fill out an application for this small business in northern Ohio, the receptionist was told to mark every black person's application with a B and set those to the side. And as you can imagine, those applicants were not given consideration. So they were singled out simply because of their race. These are the kinds of cases that we still see and are very troubling to us.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, even when you're making that discovery, I mean, you know, who lets you in on that information, and how does that information come your way that your application wasn't even considered for a particular reason? I mean, there's just a lot that goes into that, and it shocks us.
Oh, very shocking.
Yes.
Fred, what have come across your desk that most recently that you can think of?
Well, you know, I gave a good example recently about a Court of Appeal decisions about that 67-year-old, but it is, you know, we've done cases just a few years ago, a police case where a young Somali man was shot by the police who was mentally ill. The family had called for help, and we discovered that the sheriff's office had no training for their officers related to dealing with mentally ill people. They didn't have a crisis intervention team. They weren't trained in ways to approach individuals when there's nobody else around, no concern for anybody else's safety, to minimize the chance of an avoidable death. And as a result of a case, we got the training. In Columbus itself, one of the cases that we handled over the years, this is quite a while ago, but I'm going to bring it up because I'm concerned about the future, was a class action for black officers in the Columbus Police Department. And, you know, this wasn't back in the 60s and the 70s, but, you know, into the 80s, and officers were being openly excluded from certain assignments in the police department. There was discrimination in promotion and promotional testing. There was open racist graffiti in the police academy. And the result was we won the case, and there were remedial orders, actually a couple of cases, which resulted in changing the makeup of the Columbus Police Department. And now here we are, skip forward. It's been, I think, going on 15 plus years now. The orders from that case are no longer in existence. And if you look at the recent police academy members, the number of minorities, the diversity of the police force is clearly on a downward trend. Now, why is that important? Well, number one, studies show that businesses and public institutions that are diverse, I don't just mean racially, I mean in many respects, are better. The people work better, they're more creative, they're more productive. There was a reason when recently the U.S. Supreme Court had a case before it about requiring affirmative action in universities where there was proof that there had been a history of discrimination. And the military across the board said, we want diversity. Because the experience in the military is that overall it makes things better. And it is not true, you know, I have to disagree a little bit about the notion that it's always hard to prove discrimination. It is hard, and it's harder. Many industries are much more subtle now in the discrimination. But there's also a lot of overt discrimination, as you just described. I can't tell you how many women will come into a lawyer's office who does this kind of work. I mean, they're grabbed, open, sexist comments, disgusting jokes. It's blatant. It's not subtle. And unfortunately, there are a lot of times when individuals won't do anything about it.
Wow. Well, I understand we have a caller on the line. Thank you for your comments. Caller, are you there with your question or your comment?
Yes.
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you. I have another question for Attorney Gaddis. I called a while ago. Do you do systemic discrimination cases? Class action systemic discrimination cases?
I have, and that the case I was mentioning, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
That brings up a good point, if I can make it. Because of limitations, it is my belief that one of the greatest tools that has changed the workplace in this country to make them more diverse were class actions. Because it's hard to imagine changing the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of even large corporations in this country, individual case by individual case. But through class actions, courts have transformed whole corporate cultures and required EEO training. But in the last few years, we have seen a trend to limit class actions and make it much harder to do them. And that causes great concern in my mind for the future of civil rights.
And mine too.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to just get a quick question out there in regards to, our youth of today, because they're so far removed from the civil rights movement and that whole action, and I think because they are our future, right. And to better understand discrimination and then also not to discriminate. Mm-hmm. How do we motivate them or educate them to being better informed and to better understand where the country has come from, not even back in the 60s, but even farther back into the 1800s and through all of that? How do we do that? Or is there something that is effective? I know the House of Rights Commission is also doing something.
We try to do a lot. We place a heavy emphasis on the education and outreach that we do. We attend a number of or go to a number of classrooms throughout the state, universities and colleges, conveying this message and letting them know what civil rights is about and how it affects them and the fact that they need to know their rights. We go to high schools, colleges, middle schools, and talk to students. You have to provide them with the tools and the knowledge. First and foremost. And one of the ways that we do this in a statewide effort is through our annual Dr. Martin Luther King Art, Essay, and Multimedia Contest. And this is something that we really place a lot of emphasis on. We get nearly 2,000 entries every year. And the contest, the purpose of it is to encourage students to think about the message that Dr. King was preaching, the message that he left for us. And because I would agree with Fred that civil rights is something that impacts us all, because what affects one of us affects all of us. And these students provide very thoughtful responses to this contest and participate, like I said, in huge numbers. So this is something we do every year. This year we'll hold our annual celebration on February 23rd during Black History Month, and we'll invite these students to come to Columbus and read their essays and display their artwork, and really encourage them to think about the message that Dr. King has left behind and the legacy that he's left. But we also encourage them to think about how they're going to act, what they're going to do in their communities, and how they're going to affect change. So I think that is really important, encouraging students to learn about the history, but also encouraging them to put that into action.
Exactly. Fred, last words?
Last words.
Well, that and some last words.
I don't know the solution. That's the truth. People understand discrimination best, sadly, when they experience it. It's hard to convey to people what it's like when you're a 40-year-old, let's say a single woman supporting a kid or two kids, and your life is a living hell because you're being subjected to all kinds of sexist comments and maybe even worse. But you need your job. And if you make a complaint about it and you get fired, and your whole career is lost. You don't recover from a career at that stage in your life like that. It takes a long time. Same thing for somebody, you have an African American working in a company, and I've had cases. You're talking about cases where nooses are placed above their workstation, and you get pictures with KKK and a rifle, and you're next.
Or in the bathroom.
Right, and that's the overt stuff.
That's right.
And if that's going on, you know that there are some feelings like that. Now, how do you convince, a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old who may be going to a school, first of all, where there isn't much diversity, and they haven't had those experiences? Well, all I can say is you have to expose them to people who've been through it, and there needs to be a lot more of that. There needs to be a lot more real-life portrayals about life on TV, because TV is an addiction, and we're addicted. And I've seen TV shows where there's allusions to discrimination, but have you seen a show that on a weekly basis really conveys what it's like and how real it is? I haven't.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Well, such powerful information.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk for hours,
Yes.
hours on this, and we'll have to revisit this not just during the celebrations of Dr. King, but also I think throughout the year that we need to do this. As you talk about, we need to keep talking about this and having this conversation. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate your time, and if they want to get a hold of the House of Rights Commission, I got a complaint. How do I get a hold of the House of Rights Commission?
You can visit our website at www.crc.ohio.gov, and you can call us toll free at 888-278-7101.
All right, great. And attorney?
Fred.
Sorry, Fred.
Instead of giving a plug for myself, what I'd like to ask people to do is, there is about to be a legislative effort in Ohio, spearheaded by the Chamber of Commerce, to really so weaken Ohio civil rights laws that they would be almost ineffectual.
Wow.
And I would just ask people to pay attention, and when you become aware of that legislation, which may come up in the next month or two, please do something about it.
Yeah, so being aware, educate yourself, because these things, it sounds like they're trying to turn back.
Chamber?
The Ohio Chamber of Commerce,
Okay.
a bill in the state legislature about Ohio's anti-discrimination laws.
Great. Well, we also talk about, and to that point, we talk about education and going back. We also do, and I get this plug in though, the Civil Rights Tour. We do a Civil Rights Tour from April 10th through the 14th coming up. We want to get kids involved in that. So if you have young people, and or yourself, young and old, because like you talk about, we want to be able to have the older generation impart that education onto to the younger generation.
And have some experience,
As
you were talking about, Fred.
Exactly
you.
right. Well, thank you for that time. Thank you so much for being our guest, and we'll have to have you back. So we'll be right back. Our second segment, we're going to be talking about the Martin Luther King March and program. Great events coming up, celebrations coming up throughout this upcoming weekend. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these words.